Bashar al-Assad is one of the most notorious dictators in modern history. He came to power in Syria in 2000 after the death of his father, Hafez al-Assad, who was president for nearly 30 years. Under Bashar's rule, Syria was embroiled in a civil war and the country descended into chaos. In this video, we will examine the life of Bashar al-Assad and examine how his presidency contributed to unrest and violence in the Middle East. We will also see how his actions have led to a humanitarian crisis and the displacement of millions of Syrians. Assad was born into a wealthy family. Bashar al-Assad was born on September 11, 1965 into a powerful and influential Alawite family in Damascus, Syria. His father, Hafez al-Assad, had been president of Syria since 1971, ruling the country with an iron fist. Bashar was educated in England, where he earned degrees in ophthalmology and studied for a PhD at the Western Eye Hospital in London. After his father's death in 2000, Bashar returned to Syria and was elected president the following year in a referendum. During his early years in office, he implemented economic liberalization policies and sought to promote a Damascus spring of political reforms. However, these reforms were short-lived as the Assad regime cracked down on dissent, jailing and torturing protesters and dissidents. In 2011, the Syrian civil war began after peaceful protests calling for greater freedom and democracy were violently suppressed by Assad's government. Since then, the country has been plagued by war and human rights abuses, with Assad accused of using chemical weapons against his own citizens. Despite international pressure and sanctions, Assad remains president of Syria. Assad was educated in England and Syria. Bashar al-Assad, the current president of Syria, was born in Damascus in 1965 into a wealthy family. His father, Hafez al-Assad, had been president of Syria since 1971 and was determined to groom his son Bashar as his successor. To prepare Bashar for his future role, he was sent to England to study at the Western Eye Hospital in London. After completing his medical training, he returned to Syria and began studying ophthalmology at Damascus University. He also attended military academies in Syria and Russia and was commissioned as a lieutenant colonel in the Syrian army in 1994. With his education complete, Bashar was called back to Syria to take up the position of president after his father's death in 2000. Despite his lack of political experience, he took on the role and quickly proved himself to be a ruthless leader who was unafraid of using violence against those who disagreed with him. His regime was known for its human rights abuses, and it wasn't long before his rule was challenged by a series of protests in 2011 which sparked the Syrian civil war. Assad became president after the death of his father. In 2000, Bashar al-Assad was elected president of Syria following the death of his father, Hafez al-Assad, who had ruled the country since 1971. Following his father's death, Bashar quickly assumed power and moved quickly to consolidate control. He began instituting reforms that allowed for greater freedom of expression and improved economic conditions. At the same time, he maintained the same authoritarian style of rule as his father, eliminating any potential opposition. He also sought to enhance Syria's role in the Middle East by increasing ties with other countries and pursuing diplomatic relations with countries like Iran and Russia. His regime was criticized by international observers for its human rights abuses, such as the imprisonment of political dissidents and restrictions on freedom of expression. Despite this, many Syrians saw him as a reformer and a leader who would bring about change and stability to the country. Bashar has been able to maintain his hold on power despite calls for his resignation, but his presidency has been marked by the ongoing conflict in Syria. The Syrian civil war began in 2011, and Assad has been accused of using chemical weapons against civilians in an effort to quell the uprising. To this day, he remains president of Syria despite international condemnation of his actions. Assad's regime was characterized by violence and human rights abuses. Since taking power in 2000, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad has been widely accused of committing human rights abuses. Under Assad's rule, the government has been accused of carrying out various forms of repression, including arbitrary arrests, torture, and executions. Hundreds of thousands of people have been detained since the start of the Syrian civil war in 2011, and the government has allegedly carried out numerous extrajudicial killings. In addition to physical violence, Assad's regime has also been accused of suppressing freedom of speech and assembly. The government routinely censors media outlets and jails journalists who are critical of the regime. It is estimated that over 200,000 people are currently living in detention centers and prisons, where they face harsh conditions and abuse. The United Nations has accused the Syrian government of committing war crimes and other violations of international law. In 2019, a UN report concluded that the Syrian government had committed a wide range of human rights violations since 2011. The Syrian government denies any involvement in human rights abuses, and claims it is fighting against terrorism. However, human rights organizations have documented numerous cases of human rights violations and called for an end to Assad's oppressive rule. The Syrian civil war began in 2011, during Assad's presidency. When protests against the Assad regime began in March of 2011, the world watched as the Syrian people demanded reform from their longtime leader. Assad responded with brutal force, launching a campaign of violence and repression against the protesters that quickly spiraled into a full-blown civil war. The conflict has since drawn in many international actors and caused the deaths of over 500,000 Syrians. The war is complex and multifaceted, with numerous armed factions involved. On one side is the Assad regime and its allies, including Russia and Iran, who have provided significant military support for the regime. On the other side are a number of opposition forces, including the Free Syrian Army and various Islamist militias. Throughout the course of the conflict, Assad has been accused of numerous war crimes, including the use of chemical weapons against civilians. Despite these accusations, he remains in power and refuses to step down. The war continues to this day, though there have been occasional ceasefires. Assad has been accused of using chemical weapons against civilians. The use of chemical weapons in Syria by the Assad regime has been well documented. The United Nations and various human rights groups have accused Assad of using sarin, chlorine and other poisonous gases against civilians in order to crush opposition to his rule. In 2013, the United States accused Assad of using sarin gas in an attack that killed hundreds of people in a Damascus suburb. The Assad regime has denied these allegations and blamed rebel forces for the attacks. In 2017, the United States launched a missile strike against a Syrian airbase in response to another suspected chemical weapons attack. This attack was believed to have been carried out by Assad's forces, although there is no concrete evidence to support this claim. The use of chemical weapons in Syria has been condemned by the international community and is considered a war crime. Assad is still president of Syria, despite calls for his resignation. Since the beginning of the Syrian civil war in 2011, there have been calls for Bashar al-Assad to step down from his position as president. Despite international condemnation and multiple attempts by the United Nations Security Council to pressure Assad to resign, he has remained in power throughout the conflict. Though Assad's regime has been accused of numerous human rights violations and war crimes, including using chemical weapons against civilians, the Syrian government has managed to remain in power. This is partially due to Assad's extensive support from Iran and Russia. These countries have provided both financial and military aid to help Assad maintain control over the country. Despite sustained international pressure, and an internationally backed attempt to negotiate a peace deal, it appears that Assad is here to stay. In 2018, he won a landslide victory in an election which was widely considered to be a sham. Since then, he has continued his repressive tactics, and seems determined to remain in power. The conflict in Syria continues today, with no end in sight. Though Assad has been able to stay in power despite international opposition, the war continues to cause untold suffering for the people of Syria. To get other undiscovered secrets, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and like the video and share it with your friends. Thank you.